Well, good morning, everybody. Do you have a good night? Can you imagine what it must have been like getting home in a U-boat after a patrol that lasted 3 months through seas like that last night? They would have been on the surface, and they would have been pointing in the direction of France in order to get home after a 2-3 month mission in seas like that. And they would have been extremely happy with the weather we had last night. They'd be very unhappy about the weather today because the sun's out and the aircraft from Britain can see them. And this was one of the most dangerous parts of the world to be in if you were in the U-boat service in the Second World War, if the sun was out and you were visible from the air. So just think, as we go through this, the reason I'm talking about the U-boats as we pass this part of France is that this is where they were based and this was their home waters. They were either going out with some trepidation or coming back with some sense of relief as they passed through the bit of water that we're going through at the moment, the Bay of Biscay. Do you like the music that I play before these shows? Have you noticed that it has some relevance to the subject I'm talking about? Yeah, good. Some ships that I'm on, particularly the longer cruises, the passengers ask if they can have a copy of my playlist because they come in early to see what bit of music I'm going to play for this, what particular talk it is. That was a series of various variations on this movie, Das Boot. Yeah. Obviously, some of you have seen it. Those who haven't, never watch it with the British soundtrack. Watch it in German with English subtitles. It's absolute rubbish as soon as you take it out of its natural language and dub it in English. Trust me. If you've seen it dubbed in English, go back and have a look at it in German and just read it, because it's so much more powerful. And as you can see there, Rotten Tomatoes, the film review website in 1981 said it was taut, breathtakingly thrilling, devastatingly intelligent. Das Boot is one of the greatest war films ever made. And it certainly is. I mean, it's an incredible piece of work. There is a Das Boot museum. And they have the sets and the fake U-boat that they built for the studio shots. But let's get to the background of U-boats. Unterseeboot. That's German for submarine, undersea boat, obviously. Nowadays, U-boat tends to be used to describe German submarines, and every other country's submarines are called, guess what? Submarines. But U-boat is generic now to the Germans as a result of them really inventing the beast. Not seen as a fair form of warfare by most people in the navies of the world, including the German Kriegsmarine. And at the First World War, when they first started to be used in battle completely, they were seen as a very, very ungentlemanly type of warfare. Up until after the Second World War, they were not true submarines. The ships or the boats that I'm going to be talking about, none of them were true submarines. They were submersibles. They could spend a limited amount of time underwater. They spent most of their time on the surface. And the purpose that the Germans devised for them in the First World War was the same purpose that they used in the Second World War, and it was to blockade the United Kingdom for its supplies. The United Kingdom relies substantially on imports by sea. And if any of you have got ship trackers on your phones or tablets, the ships that are going past us at the moment, if you look at where they're going, a large number of them are going to Britain. So this type of U-boat was common in the First World War, and the first ungentlemanly act that happened in the First World War was the Lusitania was sunk by a U-boat on the very first day in the very first year of the war, 1915. And the German embassy in Washington, D.C. put this poster out for anybody who was thinking of travelling on the Lusitania. And the words at the bottom: notice, travellers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies. That the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or of any of her allies are liable to destruction in these waters, and that travellers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Imperial German Embassy, Washington, D.C., April 29, 1915. Lusitania had been fitted with strengthened mounts for guns, so she might have been an armed merchant ship, therefore a legitimate target. The guns had not been fitted, but the commander of U-20 who sank her didn't know that. So he sank her on her 202nd crossing of the Atlantic. She was one of the ships that was very similar to the Titanic. And of course, postcards were produced in Germany to celebrate the fact that they had sunk one of our major liners, and they claimed that it was armed. And it was certainly carrying munitions, there was no doubt about that, and significant amount of ammunition, because that's what we used our liners, sea liners, for, and still do to this day. Same as aircraft carry all sorts of cargoes, ships carry them as well, and the Lusitania was carrying small arms in its cargo and ammunition. But it was a liner, and lots of people were killed. It's going to happen again as well. On the first day of the Second World War, the SS Athenia is sunk as well by a German U-boat, much to the embarrassment of the Germans, because by then the rules had changed. So after the Treaty of Versailles, 1920, and the end of the war, the Germans had to surrender all their U-boats. They'd built 360 and they'd lost 178, but they'd sunk 11 million tons of shipping. So they had realized that this was actually, the Royal Navy was very large, the Royal Navy was very difficult to fight against, except by this means. So in the Treaty of Versailles in 1920, when it was signed, there were a huge number of restrictions on Germany, and one of them, they were forbidden completely to construct U-boats. They were not allowed to do any of them. So what did they do? They carried on. They set up design offices in Holland and in Sweden, and then they had contracts placed with countries like Turkey, and they manufactured U-boats and designed them offshore, basically, out of sight. They did the same with their Air Force. They created an Air Force secretly. They did exactly the same with the U-boats. And the U-boats were built for Finland, Turkey, Spain. There's the Finnish one at the top there. There's the Turkish one at the bottom. And the designers kept on innovating. They did what Germans do best. They're very, very good engineers. They realized that, okay, we're not allowed to do this from the Treaty of Versailles. A lot of Germans thought that the Treaty of Versailles was very, very restrictive and unfair, particularly the nationalists. So by the time they started, Hitler unveiled a Luftwaffe and a Kriegsmarine with, I'm going to be talking about the Tirpitz, so I'll be talking about their capital ships in a couple of days' time. But in terms of submarines, he unveiled the Kriegsmarine's submarine force in 1935, much to the surprise of the Allies. And by the start of World War II, they had 65 U-boats. But Hitler was never particularly keen on U-boats. He felt that you had to have huge, great battleships because he had a First World War mentality. He still believed in the dreadnought. The Germans never had an aircraft carrier. They had one planned, but they never built one. And they didn't have that many U-boats. But at the start of the Second World War, they had 21 U-boats at sea.
The Atlantic, Britain's lifeline. Treacherous enough in peacetime, in war, black with menace. U-boat packs stalk through the night, knowing the danger. Their victims still plow on.
Auf, mäßig frei.
And that was that. The Battle of the Atlantic was, Churchill said that at one point, the Battle of the Atlantic was the biggest worry that we had, because if we didn't have a certain amount of material each week, we would not be able to fight the Germans. And this, the early part of the war, 1939 till 1940, well, 42 really, Great Britain stood completely alone. A lot of help from the United States in terms of lend-lease and assistance on the United States side of the Atlantic for the first start of convoys. But we'd learnt in the First World War the way to protect our merchant ships was to put them all together, because the ocean is large, you know that. Yesterday you could see lots of ships. If any of you have done cruises that cross the Atlantic, or for instance go from Cape Town, somewhere like the Cape, across the Atlantic or through the Pacific, 2 or 3 days at sea without seeing land, you might not even see a ship. And it's the same with the Atlantic. So if you concentrate all your ships together and then escort them, you have a better chance of getting them through. And we needed a continuous stream of ships supplying oil, munitions, food, and supplies. And initially, because Hitler didn't think much of U-boats, didn't think they would be effective, he used capital ships. So you have in 1939 the Graf Spee out at sea, the Graf Spee and the Deutschland, two large ships out at sea, sinking surface raiders, acting as surface raiders, sinking anything that they find in the Atlantic and dashing around very chivalrously, doing what they were legally required to do, which was to fire a shot over the bow of the ship they wanted to sink, providing the merchant ship was not armed or didn't fire back, provided the merchant ship didn't send a signal saying what was happening. They would allow the crew to get into their lifeboats. They would give them supplies and food and a compass or whatever, or they would take them prisoner and put them on the ship. And the Graf Spee, when she was taken into Montevideo in December 1939, had most of the captains of the ships that Lambsdorff, the captain of the Graf Spee, had captured, and he sent the rest of the seamen back to Germany in his supply ship called the Altmark. But they slowly got whittled down, these capital ships. They whittled down by the Royal Navy in various ways. Graf Spee was eventually scuttled off Montevideo and sits there to this day. Her mast used to be visible above the surface at low tide. Not anymore, though they've cut it away. The the Deutschland got back to Germany, and they were so embarrassed at the fact of what had happened to the Graf Spee that they changed its name to Lützow, because they didn't want a ship to be sunk that was named after the country. So the Deutschland had its name changed. But then Bismarck is sunk, and the capital ships become vulnerable, and they suddenly realize that they're very vulnerable to air attack. So Dönitz, whose name will crop up here and there in this talk, who'd been in the submarine service in the First World War, had been pushing to have more and more submarines in order to starve Britain out by sinking the ships that were supplying us. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just a naval battle between two military sources. It was a massive contribution by civilian seamen. Civilian seamen from all over the world, not necessarily from the warring powers, a lot of Chinese, a lot of Sepoy, Indian, Goan, the sort of mix of nationalities you get on a ship like this. They worked as stewards, they worked in the laundries, they worked in the engineering sections and so on. And if you were a seaman on a British ship in the Second World War and you were sunk, your pay stopped immediately. If you were in a lifeboat waiting to be rescued, your family was no longer getting any income from you. Until you signed on to your next ship, you had no pay. That's how the system worked. So this poster is a contemporary recruiting poster for sailors to join the merchant navy. And they were very brave men, and in our country they didn't get any recognition until a couple of years ago when they got a little badge to wear on their lapel, when most of them, of course, are now no longer with us. Anyway, moving forward, World War II begins, and up until the fall of France, all of the Germans' operations from U-boats had to take place from Germany. They were either in the Baltic or they were in the North Sea. And the first thing they had to do was to cross and come out of Germany and face the Royal Navy. And it wasn't good. But as soon as they took over France, they could come where we're sailing at the moment. They built bases all the way along the French coast. And that meant that they controlled the whole of the Atlantic coast from the top of Norway all the way down, and well, they should have stopped at Spain, but Franco is a great friend of Hitler's, so there are U-boat bases and torpedo replenishment bases at ports like Vigo in Spain, and even in Algeciras, opposite Gibraltar. Submarines would go in there at night and they would tie up to German merchant vessels that were sitting in that neutral port and get replenished and refueled. What they would do is they would just leave the conning tower above the water to let air in and let the crew out, and then they would clandestinely replenish themselves in Algeciras, right opposite Gibraltar. And the whole purpose of all this was to stop us doing this. These were where all the convoys were coming from to supply Great Britain in the Second World War. And here he is, the mastermind of the attacks on our shipping.
We had to sink as many ships as possible before our Anglo-American opponent could develop an effective anti-submarine defense and could replace the merchant ships which had been sunk.
Now,
German submarines must not be used for any other purposes. Their main strategic purpose was to sink as many ships as possible in the Atlantic.
You saw Dönitz give the Nazi salute in that last little clip. Very, very rarely did he use that salute, only when he was with Hitler or his cronies. He was a naval man from the pre-war Imperial Navy, and every time you see him on footage with his men, he always gave a naval salute. I can't do it because I've shattered my shoulder, so I'd do it with the wrong hand. He would give a naval salute. Can't get this one up any higher than that. So Dönitz was Hitler's successor. He was named as Hitler's successor after Hitler committed suicide. So, you know, he certainly supported him, but at the Nuremberg war trials, he was given a relatively lenient sentence. They tried to charge him with war crimes against humanity and warfare, based on the fact that he issued an order called the Dönitz Order, telling his U-boat captains not to warn ships before they were going to sink them, and not to take on any survivors if there were any survivors from the ships that they sank. And because he gave that order, he was charged. Well, his counsel made the point at the Nuremberg trials that that's exactly what the Allies did. And the reason Dönitz gave that order was a U-boat sank a ship called the SS Laconia in the middle of the Atlantic, and then realized that it was full of civilians and Italian POWs. So the U-boat towed the lifeboats for days and radioed in the open to come, asking the Allies to come to help. And Ascension Island got the Sierra Leone and Ascension Island received these signals, and they sent a long-range Liberator bomber from Ascension Island, the United States Army Air Force, and they sank the U-boat and also killed a lot of the people in the lifeboats. So after that, Dönitz gave this order. So when he was tried at Nuremberg, his counsel explained why the order was given, and he was found not guilty. He did get 10 years in prison, but as you saw, he lived to be a grand old man. It was surface ships versus U-boats. We were completely unprepared. We'd forgotten everything that we'd learnt in the First World War. We had no tactics to deal with U-boats. We didn't have any equipment that was up to date. Between 1939 and 1943, we were constantly on the brink of disaster as far as the supply of materials to the UK was concerned. But from 1943, we learnt tactics to deal, and it was very much a technological war as well. The U-boats, the U-boat men were let down by their managers and their commanders. This is a Mark VII U-boat, which was their. They started the war with Mark 7s and they finished the war with Mark 7s. But in between, they developed the most up-to-date U-boats that anyone had got in the whole war. But Hitler was all about quantity, not quality. So when he was asked to provide the funds to build the more modern U-boats that they had on their drawing boards, he refused. He just wanted more and more quantity. So Type 7s were used throughout the war, and Type 9s, which are slightly larger but could get all the way across the Atlantic to America, just further range. And there were various types of U-boat. We tend to think of them all having torpedoes. Some of them were mine layers. Some of them were oilers and refuelers. They were called milch cows. They would go out and they would go to a designated point, and then other U-boats would come and refuel from them and get replenished supplies and things like that. But Dönitz starts to win the war with Hitler on the U-boat war by getting more and more U-boats built. But he only ever had a third of his complement of U-boats on operational patrol at any one time. There were a third going out to the patrol area, a third coming back, so only one third actually on patrol. So whatever the numbers were, he could only deploy a third of them at any one time. And also his tactics were interfered with. This is the story of the Second World War. There's often historians are asked, why didn't the Allies assassinate Hitler? I mean, the Americans assassinated Admiral Yamamoto because he was such a good leader. Why didn't we assassinate Hitler? One of the reasons is that Hitler was one of our best allies, because he kept interfering with his commanders and he kept thinking that he knew better than the professionals that were in his military. And in the case of U-boats, right in the middle of a very successful period of the Battle of the Atlantic, he shifted a third of Dönitz's boats to the Mediterranean. And they had to go through the Straits of Gibraltar, 9 miles wide, with the Brits with a whole fleet stationed there and guns on land as well. So very, very dangerous. They lost a huge number of U-boats for no real purpose at all. So the Type 7, that's a lovely colour. I think it's colourised. I don't think it could have been colour because certainly unlike the Brits, soldiers, airmen and sailors in the German armed forces were allowed to take their own personal camera with them when they went to war. And most of them had a really nice Leica camera. And that's the first thing that Allied troops used to nick off them when they made them prisoners. They'd go search them for their watches and their Leica cameras. So there's some wonderful photographs of German military operations, particularly Luftwaffe and Navy, and some of them are in colour, so this might not be colourised. They used to call this bit at the back of the conning tower the Wintergarten or Wintergarten, because it was somewhere they could stand. And that changed variously as they put different armament on it. Because they were only submersibles, they spent a lot of time on the surface, so they had to progressively have better anti-aircraft weapons. So that bit of the conning tower got bigger and bigger. You've got the statistics there for this type of submarine. They were all relatively similar. They just got a little bit bigger, the ones that could get to America. And they used what they call the Rudeltaktik, the WolfPack. And it took us some time to really work out how to deal with this. Dönitz calculated he needed 300 U-boats to make this successful.
There was a signal the convoy was coming in from America to England, and that its position was not known, and that Dönitz ordered all the submarines there to the west of Ireland to form a sort of recce line, stationary recce line, to let the convoy pass through. And when the submarine was sighted, the convoy made a signal, its contact signal. This recce line was dissolved automatically, and every boat was free to go in for the attack.
Otto Kretschmer was one of the most successful U-boat captains. Most of the aces, as they called them, were killed. Kretschmer was captured in a combat situation where his U-boat was rammed and was made a prisoner. And in fact, there was a raid on Canada. They were taken to Canada, the U-boat. Most prisoners ended up in Canada, Luftwaffe and Navy. But they tried to rescue. There were 4 ace U-boat captains in prison in Canada, and they had a complete plan for them to escape and then to be rescued by U-boat off the Canadian coast. Luckily, our intelligence people found out about it, and they let them get all the way to the beach in order to try and trap the U-boat off the Canadian coast. But they captured the men again, and they didn't capture the U-boat. But this is the sort of tonnage in what they call the happy time, September 39 to June 1940, 2,300,000 tons used up. But even so, it was such a danger that the British public knew, because of the rationing of their food and clothing and everything was rationed, that everything was dependent on the sea. And they knew something wasn't working because they got newsreels like this.
The Battle of the Atlantic continues. As our convoys pass to and fro, U-boats lurk in the vast waters preparing to cut our lifelines at every opportunity. In a recent instance, it was a case of the biter bit. German planes and U-boats attacked one of our convoys of over 30 ships, but the Navy, as ever, was on its toes. Before one could say, "Hell, Hitler," the escorting warships closed in around their precious charges and proceeded to teach the Nazis a lesson.
Propaganda. Blatant propaganda. It took till 1943 before we really got a handle on it. A lot of it was to do with intelligence. At certain periods, we broke the Enigma code, so we knew what they were doing. And there were some very brave sailors, some who died, because every time a U-boat was captured, they would scuttle it, and they would have special devices to to destroy the code books and so on inside the submarine. And sailors were killed going into submarines as they were sinking to try and get the code books out. But Bletchley Park, the place in England where the code breakers, Alan Turing and so on, were based, did have the codes for a relatively short period of time, but they often changed them. And the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, used a more complex code than the Army and the Air Force. But they relied totally on radio communications to control the WolfPacks. So what happened was a chap called Harry Hemsley, a mathematics graduate, young man from Cambridge, worked out that actually you didn't need to know exactly what the messages said. You could work out from operational statistics and from the amount of traffic and where it was coming from and where it was picked up, how many submarines were likely to be in an area at a particular time. And that's basically how we found out where the submarines were. On the other hand, the Germans had broken our codes and they knew exactly where our convoys were. So it was a swing backwards and forwards, and all sorts of technology was used in order to try and find out where U-boats were on our side and to try and find out where the convoys were on their side. This is the home of a U-boat man, a stinking, fetid, damp, alternately cold, hot, hot, cold, no air conditioning in German U-boats. The US submarines, particularly the ones in the Pacific, had air conditioning of a sort. German U-boats relied totally on the conditions around them. They had the diesel engines working when they're on the surface. They had the electric engines working when they were under the surface. And if it was in the Arctic, they froze. And if it was in the tropics, they boiled. If they're in the middle of the Atlantic, whatever the temperature was in the water was how they felt. But it was sweaty, dirty. They had no water to wash with. They had only water to drink and to have in food. They had no water to wash with at all, so they all came back with beards. It was very difficult for them to shave. They had this single set of clothes. They double bunked, hot-bedded, hot bunking. They slept on the floor or around the torpedoes. And when they were setting off across the water we're on at the moment, on patrol, out of the Bay of Biscay, their boat was so full of provisions, they had 2 toilets on board. One toilet would be completely full of canned goods, and they would only be able to use that toilet after they'd used up the food. So most of their ablutions were done over the side in bad weather. Most of their cleaning and showering was done in salt water. Well, all of it was done in salt water. So you can see the sort of claustrophobic conditions that they operated in. And they were issued with 4711 eau de cologne in large containers, and they were supposed to splash this all over themselves to make it slightly more bearable. Being young men, they kept it and gave it to their girlfriends when they got back on shore, which is logical, really. But you can see 2 shots here of U-73, the crew crowded down around. That's how close they lived together. That was sunk in the Mediterranean. I'm afraid we're going to find that nearly all of them were sunk, and U-35 in November. And there's Dönitz talking to his men. They've actually shaved, but they're still in their working clothes. And this is on the left is a submarine coming in with 5 pennants showing it's got the tonnage of the 5 ships that it's sunk. So life on board a U-boat was extremely uncomfortable. They were regarded as heroes at home. I've discussed already the shortage of water and so on.
There were always men from the crew going off to be trained as NCOs because there were new boats that needed crews too. There were generally between 3 to 5 men on a U-boat who formed the core. The commander, the helmsman, the chief engineer, and maybe 1 or 2 others, a mechanic or 2. If they worked well together, then you were halfway to surviving. And as I belong to the survivors, it's a confirmation that that is what it was like.
we're passing the whole area where they were based, and they were subject to air attack in the Bay of Biscay, and of course they were subject to quite severe air attack in the ports of France that they occupied. The map on the right shows you all the ports that had U-boat bases in them. The ones in Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, Bordeaux, and Marseille were massive, huge bunkers, and they still exist today. If ever you're in any of those cities, look for, particularly if you go in a cruise ship, because you go past the bunkers to get into them. But we're not talking just, and in the Das Boot sequence that you saw at the very beginning, they were using the Saint-Nazaire, this bunker on the left there, for their filming. You can still use it. This one is being turned at the moment into a massive shopping centre with leisure facilities and stuff, but most of them are used as storage areas now. They were not impossible to damage with bombs, but they were so sophisticatedly designed that it was very difficult for the bombs to penetrate them. But to look at them now, you just wonder how they could possibly have built them. Where did they get the cement and the sand from? The cement came primarily from France and Germany, but they used the local sand and a lot of aggregate from the ports themselves. And they weren't just pens you could sail into, they were maintenance pens as well. And a couple of them had ramps, and they had translators, which was transversers. A bit like railway locomotives, they had round tables where they could turn them round and push them in to be worked on, and they had traverses where they could go sideways and into pens and dry docks. Massive constructions, and certainly they're very visible still. If you're ever in Bergen, you can see them as you sail in and out of the port. All these are still visible today. Impossible to, we tried to blow them up at the end of the Second World War, and there were some on Heligoland, and we actually used up a huge amount of German explosives that was left over at the end of the war, filled these bunkers with it. There's film of this explosion, which is similar to a nuclear explosion, and the things are still standing after it's all finished. So that's them today. Lorient, Keraman 3, they all had code names. La Rochelle, the slipway there at Lorient is where they would pull them up, and then the traverser is behind it. So the bunkers are well worth looking at if you ever go into the ports along this coast. And they were home for the U-boat men. They had barracks not close, the bunkers were targets. So they were bombed significantly, particularly by the Royal Air Force. So the men were barracked a good 20 miles outside the town and had a pretty luxurious time when they were at home. They were feted, they were heroes. So the accommodation that they had when they were on land was much better than they would have had if they'd been a soldier or an airman, because the accommodation they had when they were at work was so horrendous. But it all failed, and it failed for a number of reasons. The technology got better and better. We could pinpoint where they were. Also, radar got miniaturized to such an extent that aircraft could carry radar, and they could pick up a submarine's periscope at about 25 miles. And to try and avoid aircraft, the submarines had some of the submarines were fitted with what was called a snorkel, just like you wear to go diving, that would stick up and let air into the diesel engines. But that didn't work very well, because when the valve closed, the engine sucked in so much of the air inside the submarine that it burst the eardrums of the crews. So it was a horrendous experience to operate with that sort of thing. We also developed what were called escort carriers, merchant ships with a small, relatively small deck on top. Before that, we had catapult aircraft. In the middle photograph there is a Hawker Hurricane on a catapult. And one of the ways of finding the convoys, the Germans used to send long-range reconnaissance aircraft over the Atlantic. And as soon as one was seen, one of these Hurricanes would be shot off the front of a merchant ship, shoot the reconnaissance or chase it away, aircraft down, and then the poor pilot would have to ditch in the water next to the nearest ship and hope that he was rescued. 13 Hurricanes were launched and only one pilot was killed, but they chased off quite a few aircraft. Also, new weapons were developed. The Hedgehog, which was a sort of mortar with the Lee light, which you see on the top left, was a massive searchlight. And as the aircraft would come in with having seen the periscope or the submarine on its radar, the submarines thought that they were safe at night because even though you might be seen on radar, it wasn't accurate enough to be bombed by it. And suddenly this light would come on and the whole submarine would be illuminated. Very, very effective. And of course the code breaking. So the surrender of the Kriegsmarine at the end of the war meant that all their submarines had to be taken to ports in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and then they were eventually scuttled or destroyed. And there you've got U-boats at the bottom there moored in Ireland after the surrender, and at the top you've got a Royal Naval ensign above the Kriegsmarine flag. The cost, well, there you have it. 32,000 merchant seamen, 2,828 merchant ships, 3,700 airmen on the Allied side. The numbers are there, but it was terrible to be a U-boat man. 75% chance of not surviving the war. The worst casualty rate of any arm of the military on any side. I mean, the American 8th Air Force lost 76,000 young men. The Royal Air Force, in bombers alone, the Royal Air Force lost 55,000 in their bombing campaign, young men, all average age of 20, 21. Pro rata, the 30,000 U-boat sailors, all again in their early 20s, pro rata for the submarine service itself, it was 75%. And of course, there were Italians as well, very good submariners. So let's not forget the cost on both sides, because that's what the story is really about, because it should warn us not to do it again. Thanks very much.